Hand over the bags. My mom says you owe us.
The kid is 16, blocking my trunk, arms crossed like this is already settled. I set the groceries down, slowly, on my own driveway.
Son, you want to think very carefully about what you just said.
Or what? You gonna call the cops?
I look at him for exactly 3 seconds.
No, I won't.
His mother hits my porch 4 minutes later, phone already out, voice already raised.
I am calling the police and you will regret this. Do you understand me? Do you have any idea who I am in this neighborhood? Tam.
I pick my groceries back up. Ma'am, I say.
Ma'am, make the call.
She did, confident, satisfied, not once stopping to ask who I was, only who she was. That was the last mistake Bettina Whitmore ever made in Meadowlark Estates. What would you do? And where are you watching from tonight? Let me take you back about 14 months before that driveway moment, because you need to understand the world I was living in to fully appreciate how spectacularly this all unraveled. I'm Chief Darnell Okafor, though at the time nobody in Meadowlark Estates knew that. The development sat just outside the city limits of Ridgecroft, Tennessee, a mid-sized town, the kind of place where high school football still fills the bleachers, and everybody eventually knows everybody's business. I'd spent 22 years working my way up through the department. Patrol, detective, lieutenant, and finally chief, appointed 8 months before I moved into the neighborhood. The new role came with a modest bump in pay and a genuine desire to decompress somewhere quiet. My therapist had actually suggested it. Get out of the apartment above the precinct parking garage, Darnell. Go somewhere with a yard. So I bought 14 Briarwood Court, 3 bedrooms, a deck that needed refinishing, a dogwood tree that had been badly over-trimmed by the previous owner, and a homeowners association that I, stupidly, assumed would be a minor administrative footnote in my life. I kept my career to myself, intentionally. After 2 decades in law enforcement, you develop a strong preference for not broadcasting what you do for a living. People act differently. They either treat you like a personal security service, or they get weirdly defensive, like you're cataloging their jaywalking. I just wanted to be the neighbor who waves, mows on Sundays, and goes back inside. I introduced myself simply as a city employee. Nobody pressed further. The smell of the neighborhood on the day I moved in is still vivid to me. Fresh-cut grass baking under a July sun, the faint chemical tang of someone running a pressure washer 2 houses down, and above it all, the Swedish rot of an overflowing garbage bin that someone had failed to roll back to the curb per the HOA's very specific schedule. That bin, I would later learn, belonged to the household directly across the street, the Whitmore household. Bettina Whitmore was 53, trim in the way of someone who treats exercise as a competitive sport, and she wore authority the way other women wore cardigans, permanently, without thinking about it. She had served as HOA board president for 6 consecutive years. She had personally drafted the amendments that established the landscaping color palette guidelines. Yes, that's a real thing. And yes, there was a laminated chart, and she had a habit of appearing at your property line at moments that were always, technically, accidental. Just out for my walk, she'd say, while clearly reading the brand name on your lawn fertilizer. Her son, Cody, was 16, and built like someone had taken a golden retriever's energy and stuffed it into a teenager who had never once been told to sit. He drove a golf cart, HOA permitted, naturally, around the cul-de-sac with the territorial confidence of a much smaller animal who had no idea what the larger animals around him were capable of. The first unfair act came 3 weeks after I moved in. I received a written HOA violation notice, hand-delivered, with a little red sticker on the envelope like it was a summons, citing me for failure to maintain approved exterior paint integrity on my mailbox post. The post was white. The approved color was antique linen. They are, objectively, the same color. I have a photograph. The fine was $40. I paid it. Not because I thought it was right, but because I was tired, and I had 7 cases on my desk and a department budget meeting on Thursday. Pick your battles. I should have picked that one, because Bettina Whitmore read my payment as confirmation that she had found exactly the kind of neighbor she liked best. Someone who would absorb whatever she handed out and write a check. She was already wrong about that. She just didn't know it yet. The mailbox fine was just the warm-up act. By September, 6 weeks after I'd moved in, Bettina had escalated to a rotation system that I can only describe as impressive in its pettiness. Every Tuesday, a new notice. Gutters required cleaning even though I'd cleaned them the previous weekend. My recycling bins were placed 3 inches too close to the property line on collection day, a measurement she had apparently made, because the notice specified approximately 3 inches, in a font that suggested someone had typed it with genuine fury. Then came the notice about my decorative stone border around the dogwood tree, which she claimed violated HOA Bylaw 7, Section C, Paragraph 2, regarding unauthorized hardscape modifications. The decorative stones came with the house. The previous owner had put them there. I had the inspection report to prove it. I drafted a response letter, polite, precise, with the inspection report attached, and slid it under the HOA management office door on a Thursday morning. The crunch of gravel under my boots as I walked back to my car felt satisfying in a small way. Evidence submitted. Case closed, I thought. That Friday, Cody Whitmore knocked on my door. I answered it in my off-duty clothes. Jeans, old department alumni t-shirt, the kind of outfit that screams, "I am not working right now, please honor that." Cody was standing on my porch with the golf cart parked behind him, one hand on the door frame like he owned the place, smirking the specific smirk of a kid who has been told, repeatedly, that his mother runs this neighborhood, and that makes him adjacent to royalty. "My mom says your letter has a lot of mistakes in it," he said. I waited. "She also says you have a leak under your driveway expansion joint that's violating the stormwater runoff code. She's going to file with the county." The expansion joint. I actually had to look that up later. It's the small gap between a driveway and the public sidewalk, designed to allow concrete to flex without cracking. Mine was functioning perfectly. But stormwater runoff code sounds technical and threatening if you don't know anything about civil infrastructure, which Bettina had correctly guessed I might not. She guessed wrong. 16 years earlier, I'd worked closely with the County Public Works Department on a water contamination case that required me to learn, in exhaustive detail, exactly how municipal stormwater systems work. I told Cody to have his mother send me the specific code citation in writing. He blinked. That was clearly not the response the script called for. "She'll just go to the county," he said again, as if repetition made it more threatening. "Great," I said. "I'd love a written citation. Have a good afternoon." I closed the door. Outside, I could hear the electric whir of the golf cart reversing down my driveway. What happened next took about 10 days. Bettina escalated immediately. She filed a community concern report with the HOA board, which she also chaired, so filing with the board was essentially sending herself a memo, and she began what I can only describe as a whisper campaign. The Donovans at number 12 told me apologetically that Bettina had mentioned something about code issues at my property at the last neighborhood coffee gathering. The Kowalczyks at number 8 said she'd just happened to mention that the new resident on Briarwood had been slow to cooperate with community standards. It was subtle, it was strategic, and it was designed to do one specific thing: isolate me before I could build any relationships that might complicate her operation. Here's what she didn't understand about 2 decades in law enforcement. I have a finely tuned sense for when someone is running a play. I've watched better operators than Bettina Whitmore try to cut off a target's social support before making a move. I recognized the pattern before the second whisper had traveled half the block, so I did what any investigator does at the beginning of a case. I started taking notes: date, time, content of each violation notice, the specific bylaw cited, whether the bylaw actually said what she claimed it said, because I was reading them now, all 47 pages, with the same attention I used to give criminal statutes. And I started doing something else. I started being a very, very good neighbor to everyone on Briarwood Court, except Bettina Whitmore. Not aggressive, not performative. I just started actually knowing the people around me. By mid-October, I knew that the Donovans' oldest daughter had just gotten into the pre-med program at UT Knoxville. I knew that the Kowalczyks had a pipe issue under their front walk that they'd been afraid to address because Bettina had told them any exterior work required HOA pre-approval and a 6-week review period. I knew that 3 other residents had received notices they privately believed were retaliatory, but hadn't pushed back on because they were afraid of a woman with a laminated color chart and a son on a golf cart. That bothered me more than anything she'd done to me directly. November arrived cold and early that year. The dogwood tree dropped its leaves fast, the way trees do when a frost catches them off guard, and the crackle of dried leaves underfoot was constant on my morning walks. I was doing a lot of morning walking by then, partly because my doctor kept telling me to, partly because it gave me a reason to drift naturally past every house on Briarwood and see what was happening without it looking deliberate. What was happening by mid-November was this. Bettina Whitmore had realized that her whisper campaign wasn't achieving full saturation. I hadn't been isolated. If anything, I'd become reasonably well-liked. People waved. Marcus Donovan had come over one Saturday, and we'd spent 3 hours refinishing my deck together while his wife brought out coffee so strong it could have powered a patrol car. I was in the neighborhood now, genuinely, and Bettina could feel it, so she shifted tactics. The HOA held a board meeting every second Thursday of the month in the community room of the development's small clubhouse, a building that smelled perpetually of dry erase markers and the ghost of someone's reheated casserole. I attended for the first time in November. I sat in the back row in a quiet jacket and watched Bettina run the meeting like it was a small principality. She had the gavel. She set the agenda. She recognized speakers and declined to recognize others with a smoothness that was genuinely impressive. She also introduced under new business a proposed amendment. Any resident flagged for 3 or more violations within a calendar year would be subject to a mandatory HOA audit of their property, an in-person inspection by the board's designated representative, which was, naturally, Bettina. I had received 3 violation notices. The timing was not coincidental. After the meeting, when most residents had filtered out to the parking lot, I stopped at the folding table where the HOA management company's local representative, a tired-looking man named Philip Greer, who commuted from 3 towns over, was packing up a rolling briefcase. "Quick question," I said. "That amendment, for it to take effect this calendar year, what's the approval process?" Philip looked grateful that someone had asked him a direct question. 2/3 board vote plus 30 days public comment period. So if it passed tonight, which it did, earliest enforcement would be January 15th. I thanked him. January 15th. 6 weeks. I wrote it down. 2 days later, the incident with the groceries happened for the first time. I say first time because it happened twice, escalating each time, which tells you everything you need to know about how Bettina's household operated. I'd driven back from the Ridgecroft Fresh Market. 4 bags, mostly produce, a rotisserie chicken that was going to be dinner for 2 nights, and as I was pulling them out of the trunk, Cody appeared at the edge of my driveway. He did that thing teenagers do where they materialize somewhere without you seeing them arrive. "Hey," he said, "we need those." I looked at him over the top of the grocery bags. "Those bags," he said, with a slight impatient gesture, as if I was being slow. "My mom said to come get 'em, you know, because of what you owe." The audacity was so complete that for a moment I just stood there in the cold, rotisserie chicken smell rising from the bag, trying to determine if this was actually happening. What I owed. To Bettina Whitmore, expressed as groceries. "Walk me through what I owe," I said. He got a little flustered. The script, apparently, hadn't anticipated a question. Just the stuff. The HOA stuff. My mom handles it. "Okay," I said, "then your mom can come talk to me directly." I picked up my bags and went inside. Through the front window, I watched him stand in my driveway for about 45 seconds, clearly reconsidering his options, then golf cart his way back across the cul-de-sac. Bettina was on my porch 11 minutes later. She was dressed for the cold in a fleece with the HOA logo embroidered on the chest. Yes, the HOA had embroidered fleeces. She'd had them made. And she had the particular energy of someone who had spent the drive over rehearsing what they were going to say. "Mr. Okafor," she began, "I think we need to get some things straight about your obligations to this community." I invited her in. I made coffee. And I listened to 22 minutes of Bettina Whitmore's theory of what I owed her, which boiled down to, she was the authority here. I had been a problem since day one, and the proper thing to do would be to cooperate with her audit and stop making things difficult. I nodded throughout, took mental notes, asked 2 clarifying questions. She left satisfied. I called my attorney the next morning. December brought the neighborhood Christmas lighting competition, HOA sanctioned, with a judging rubric that Bettina had personally authored, and which somehow always resulted in the Whitmore house winning the Community Spirit Award. The streets of Meadowlark Estates twinkled after dark, and the smell of wood smoke drifted between houses on cold evenings. It felt, on the surface, like a peaceful place to live. Underneath it, the current was picking up speed. My attorney, a woman named Cecily Farr, who had spent 14 years in municipal and property law, and who had the cheerful, organized energy of someone who genuinely enjoys finding the load-bearing crack in a flawed legal structure, had reviewed the HOA governing documents over a long weekend. She called me on a Monday morning. "Okay," she said, before I'd even finished my coffee. "I found 3 things. The first, the mandatory audit amendment Bettina had pushed through was almost certainly invalid. Tennessee HOA law, specifically the Tennessee Horizontal Property Act and the relevant provisions of the Common Interest Community Ownership Act, required that any new enforcement mechanism include an appeal process accessible to affected residents before enforcement begins. The amendment had no appeal provision. It was, in Cecily's words, a procedural orphan. Takeaway: if an HOA passes an enforcement rule with no appeal process, it likely violates state HOA law and can be challenged before it's ever used. The second finding was more interesting. Bettina had been assessing fines, including my mailbox fine, under a schedule that had been adopted by the board in 2021. But the HOA's original CC and Rs, filed with the county recorder when the development was built, required that any fine schedule be ratified by a full resident vote, not just a board vote. That vote had never happened, which meant every fine levied under that schedule, for 4 years, was potentially uncollectible. Cecily estimated the total value of fines issued under that schedule across the whole development at somewhere in the range of $18,000 to $22,000. The third finding was the quietest and the sharpest. Bettina Whitmore, as HOA president, had signing authority on the association's operational account. The most recent annual financial disclosure, which HOA boards are required to file with residents under Tennessee law, contained a line item for administrative services totaling just over $9,000 for the previous fiscal year. The payee on those administrative services invoices was a company called Whitmore Property Management Solutions. That company was registered to Bettina Whitmore. She was paying herself, through the HOA, without disclosing the conflict of interest, without resident approval. I sat with that for a minute. The morning light was coming through my kitchen window at the angle it does in December, flat and pale gold, and my coffee had gone cold while I listened to Cecily explain what she was looking at. Outside, I could hear the distant whir of Cody's golf cart doing a circuit. "How solid is the self-dealing finding?" I asked. "Solid enough that I'd be surprised if the HOA management company's insurance carrier didn't take it very seriously," Cecily said. "And solid enough that if it went to a resident's vote of no confidence, she'd have a hard time surviving it." We agreed she'd send me a formal memo. I printed it out and put it in a manila folder in my desk. Not to use yet, just to have. Meanwhile, Bettina had graduated from notices to something more operationally aggressive. She had begun photographing my property. I noticed her phone raised in my direction on 3 separate occasions, apparently building a documentation file of her own. She'd also had a conversation with my next-door neighbor on the left, an older widower named Everett Sims, that Everett had the grace to repeat to me almost word for word. "She told me you'd been rude to her," Everett said, with the slightly pained expression of a man being asked to participate in something he didn't agree with, "and that I should be careful about any informal agreements we might have made about the property line hedge." We had no informal agreements. He'd helped me trim the hedge because he was a kind man who'd been doing it for 20 years on his own. "She's trying to thin out your corner," Everett said. He was 71 and had been in the neighborhood for 18 years and had watched HOA presidents come and go, with the practiced patience of someone who knows that all bad weather eventually passes. "She does it to anyone she decides to make an example of." I asked him if he'd ever pushed back. "Never had enough company," he said. He was about to. The new year came in quiet. January in Ridgecroft goes gray and damp and stays that way for weeks, and the neighborhood had settled into its winter rhythms. People shoveled when they had to, waved from windshields instead of front walks, and the HOA's violation notice cadence slowed, because even Bettina, apparently, didn't enjoy standing in a cold yard with a measuring tape. but I had been doing homework. On a Sunday afternoon in the second week of January, I drove downtown to the county courthouse and spent 2 hours at the recorder's office pulling the original development documentation for Meadowlark Estates. Recorded deeds, the original subdivision plat, the CC and Rs as filed in 2003, and the Declaration of the Homeowners Association. And there, on page 14 of the original CC and R document, buried in a subsection titled Architectural Standards Enforcement, that appeared to have been drafted by someone who intended for it never to be read, was a clause that changed everything. It read, approximately, in the event that any enforcement action initiated by the association is subsequently determined to have been commenced without documented evidence of actual violation, the association shall be liable for reasonable, legal, and administrative costs incurred by the affected member, not to exceed the greater of $500, or 3 times the value of any fine assessed. Triple damages, payable by the association, for a violation that couldn't be documented. The mailbox fine, documented? Let's check. The original notice cited failure to maintain approved exterior paint integrity. The approved color was antique linen. My mailbox post was white. I had a photograph. A color matching analysis by any hardware store's paint scanner would confirm they were within 5% of the same shade. That notice was, in the language of the clause, without documented evidence of actual violation. Triple damages on a $40 fine is $120. That's not the point. The point is that Bettina had issued me 11 notices. I had documentation of compliance or irrelevance for every single one. 11 notices, each potentially triggering the clause, each potentially exposing the HOA, and by extension, Bettina personally, given the self-dealing issue Cecily had identified, to liability. Here's the legal mechanic in plain English. HOA, CC, and Rs are contractual documents. Both the association and the resident are parties to that contract. A clause like this one is enforceable by the resident in small claims court or through arbitration, depending on the CC and Rs dispute resolution section. No attorneys required for small claims. Maximum per claim filing fee in Tennessee, $50. Takeaway: always pull the original CC and R document from the county recorder, not the board's version, which may be edited, because original recorded language often contains protections that subsequent boards quietly stop mentioning. I sat in the courthouse parking lot for a few minutes after I got back to my car. The heater was running, and rain was tapping the windshield in that soft, insistent way that makes you feel like the weather is trying to get your attention. I had Bettina Whitmore's conflict of interest on paper. I had an invalid enforcement amendment. I had an unratified fine schedule. I had an original CC and R clause that turned her violations into potential liability. And I had a police department. I hadn't used any of it yet. That was going to change on January 15th. That was the date the mandatory audit was supposed to begin. She was planning to come to my house. I started planning what she'd find when she got there. There's a satisfaction specific to building a case properly. I had felt it 100 times in the department, that quiet, focused energy of assembling everything before making a move. You don't rush. You don't tip your hand. You build until the structure is solid enough to hold weight from any angle, and then you move. The first call I made was to Cecily. I told her what I'd found at the recorder's office. She was quiet for about 4 seconds, which for Cecily meant she was already 3 steps ahead. "Okay," she said, "here's what we file and when." She drafted 3 documents. The first was a formal written notice to the HOA management company, Philip Greer's outfit, citing the invalid audit amendment and the unratified fine schedule, with the specific statutory references attached. Under Tennessee law, a management company that continues to enforce rules it has been formally notified are potentially invalid takes on its own exposure. This was the warning shot. Philip didn't want exposure. Philip wanted to go back to his commute and his rolling briefcase. We sent it certified mail on January 8th. The second document was a demand letter to the HOA board, citing the self-dealing issue and requesting a full accounting of the Whitmore Property Management Solutions payments. This one didn't go to Bettina. It went to the 2 other board members, who, as Cecily explained, now had personal fiduciary liability if they continued to ignore a documented conflict of interest after being formally notified. Fiduciary liability means they could be sued, not just the HOA. We sent it to them at their home addresses, also certified, also on January 8th. Bettina received her copies of both letters on January 9th. I know this because Everett Sims called me that afternoon and said he'd seen her standing at her mailbox for an unusually long time. The third prong was the one I built quietly, over 2 weeks, with a patience that my therapist would have approved of. I had conversations, unhurried, over coffee or on morning walks, with every resident on Briarwood Court and the adjacent Clovermill Lane who had mentioned, at any point, feeling pressured by the HOA. That was 11 households. From those conversations, I compiled a voluntary record. 9 residents who were willing to sign a written account of violations they believed were pretextual, 2 who preferred to remain anonymous, but provided documentation. Combined with my own 11 notices, I had a pattern of conduct that, assembled and organized, told a clear story. Here's the practical mechanic of what I was doing, because it's something any organized person can replicate. Under Tennessee HOA law, residents have the right to petition for a special meeting of the full membership if they gather signatures from at least 10% of the development's eligible members. Meadowlark Estates had 174 units. 10% was 18 signatures. I had 9 willing to sign publicly. I needed 9 more. I got them in the first 2 weeks of January, from households on streets Bettina had never bothered to cultivate. People whose names never showed up in her meetings because she'd never seen them as threats. The Osei family on Clovermill had been paying a fine for 2 years on a shed that predated the HOA's own formation. A retired teacher named Millicent Vance had a written warning about wind chimes, that she'd simply never appealed because she didn't know she could. 18 signatures became 23. I filed the petition for a special membership meeting on January 12th. Under the C, and Rs, the meeting had to be held within 30 days. That set the timeline. January 15th, Bettina's audit day, would now occur 3 days after she received official notice that a special meeting had been filed. The audit, the meeting, and Cecily's letters would all be active at the same time. Different fronts, different pressures, same target. The final piece was the most direct. 2 days before January 15th, I called my department's non-emergency line and left a message for the duty sergeant, my duty sergeant, explaining that I had reason to expect an unauthorized entry attempt at my property on that date, and that if anyone called requesting law enforcement response to my address on the 15th, he should personally ensure that I was notified before any unit was dispatched. I didn't say why. He didn't ask. 20 years of working together means a lot of questions don't need to be asked out loud. I refinished the last board on my deck that evening. The wood was cold, and the polyurethane smelled sharp in the night air. And somewhere across the cul-de-sac, the Whitmore house lights were on in every room. Let them stay on. I was ready. January 10th and 11th were the days Bettina spent trying to dismantle what she didn't fully understand yet. She started with Philip Greer. She called his office. I found this out later through Philip himself, who was by this point somewhat relieved to have a reason to talk to the least confrontational party in the situation, and demanded he disregard Cecily's letter on the grounds that Bettina, as board president, had authority over all HOA management decisions. Phil told her that once a formal written notice, citing statutory liability, had been received, he was required by his company's E&O insurance policy to document his response and could not simply disregard it. She apparently used the word ridiculous 4 times in a 7-minute call. Then she went to the 2 other board members. Gerald Fitch and Diana Pruitt had been on the board for 3 and 5 years respectively, and both of them operated on roughly the same political logic. Bettina did the work. Bettina made the decisions. They showed up and voted yes. That had been a comfortable arrangement, right up until certified letters arrived at their homes, documenting that a conflict of interest had been ongoing under their watch, and that they had been formally notified. Gerald called Cecily's office and asked, politely, nervously, whether there was any way to resolve this quietly. Diana Pruitt did not call anyone. She reportedly began attending her sister's church in a neighboring county that week, which suggested she'd concluded that strategic absence was her best option. Bettina then made what I consider the defining error of the whole episode. She called someone she shouldn't have, a man named Terrence Boyle, who ran a private property inspection service in the county and who had done work for the HOA management company before. She hired him, apparently, to perform an independent inspection of my property and produce a report documenting violations before the 15th, documentation she could use to justify the audit before a potential legal challenge. Terrence Boyle showed up on my street on January 13th. He walked my property line slowly, phone raised, making notes. He was professional about it, stayed on the public easement, never stepped on my grass, documented the expansion joint, the gutters, the landscaping stones. He spent about 20 minutes. What he couldn't have known, and what Bettina certainly didn't know, was that 2 months earlier, in November, I had applied for and received a certificate of compliance from the county's Building and Zoning Department, covering my entire property. The certificate, which any property owner can request, documents that the property meets all applicable codes as of the inspection date. It cost $60 and took about 45 minutes of a county inspector's time. Takeaway: if you're in an ongoing dispute with an HOA or municipality over alleged code violations, request a formal certificate of compliance from the relevant county authority. It creates an official record that supersedes a private board's assertion of violation, and it's often surprisingly inexpensive. Whatever Terrence Boyle reported back to Bettina, she apparently found insufficient because she escalated again. On the morning of January 14th, the day before the scheduled audit, I received a hand-delivered letter from Bettina, not typed, handwritten, which told me something about her emotional state. It accused me of orchestrating a campaign of harassment against the association, demanded I withdraw the petition for the special meeting, and stated that if I did not comply by 5 p.m. that day, she would be forced to contact law enforcement regarding threatening and obstructive behavior. I photographed the letter. I sent the photograph to Cecily. I went for a walk. The threatening and obstructive behavior, for the record, was requesting a special meeting of HOA members, retaining an attorney, and filing documents at the county courthouse, all of which are legal rights of a property owner in the state of Tennessee. Here's what I knew that Bettina did not. In 22 years of law enforcement, I have processed a lot of calls that were made by people in her exact situation. People who believe they are powerful, right up until the moment the structure they thought they controlled turns out to be facing the other direction. They always call the police at this stage. It's the last lever they think they have. The call was coming. I'd told my sergeant, and I had one more thing to prepare before she made it. I called a reporter. Her name was Joellen Pask, and she covered municipal affairs for the Ridgecroft Courier. We'd had a professional relationship going back 7 years, and when I told her I had something she'd want to see on the morning of January 15th, she said she'd be there. I gave her my address. I gave her a parking spot. Everything was in place. January 14th, 5 p.m., came and went. I did not withdraw the petition. At 5:23, I received a text from a blocked number containing only the words, "Last Chance." I forwarded it to Cecily, who added it to the file. That evening, 3 things happened that I only reconstructed afterward from various accounts. First, Bettina called an emergency session of the remaining willing board member. That was just Gerald Fitch, since Diana Pruitt was still at her sister's church, and the two of them passed a resolution reaffirming the audit's legitimacy. A 2-person board cannot constitute quorum for most HOA decisions under Tennessee law, but they apparently decided to try. Second, Cody was dispatched to canvass the street, knocking on doors and telling neighbors that I had been issuing false legal threats against the HOA, and that anyone who'd sign my petition should be aware of the risks. He made it to 4 houses before Marcus Donovan, who is 6'3" and spent 12 years as a union steward, and has exactly 0 tolerance for a 16-year-old talking to his family about legal risks, asked him to leave his porch. Third, and this is the part that tells you everything about Bettina's state of mind by the end of that evening, she baked something. I know this because Everett Sims saw her kitchen light on past midnight, and the next morning there was a plate of cookies outside the door of Gerald Fitch. Gerald told me this himself, with the slightly bewildered expression of a man who realizes he has been courted with baked goods at 1 a.m. and is unsure what that says about his life choices. I slept well that night. I have learned, over the course of a career that has included some genuinely dangerous moments, that there is a specific kind of calm that settles in when you have done everything you can do in preparation, and the only thing left is to wait for the morning. The house was warm, the deck I'd refinished smelled faintly of polyurethane, and the dogwood tree out front was bare and skeletal and beautiful in the way that dormant things are, full of something that wasn't showing yet. January 15th, 7 a.m. The special meeting petition had been filed. The certified letters were received. My certificate of compliance was in a folder on my kitchen table, along with the original CC and R clause, Cecily's memo, and the accounting demand. Joellen Pask's car was parked 2 houses down at 7:15. Cecily herself had driven up from the city and was sitting in my living room with a cup of coffee, wearing the expression of someone at a chess match who has already seen the end of the game. At 8:43, I heard the golf cart. Cody first, riding ahead like an outrider, then Bettina on foot behind him carrying a clipboard and, I will never forget this, a measuring tape on her belt. She was wearing the HOA fleece. She had dressed for this. She walked up my driveway with the purposeful energy of someone who has rehearsed. She rang my doorbell. I opened the door. "Mr. Okafor," she said, with the tone of someone delivering a verdict. "The board is here to conduct the mandatory compliance audit of your property. I'm going to need you to provide access to your rear yard. And if you obstruct this inspection in any way, I will be calling the police." I looked at her for a moment. "You're welcome to make that call," I said. She took out her phone. She dialed. Here's the thing about calling 911 in Ridgecroft, Tennessee. The call goes to the county dispatch center, which patches to the department's duty sergeant, who is, in this particular instance, a 20-year veteran named Sergeant First Class Antoinette Webb, who has worked for me for 6 years, and who received my message on January 12th, and had, as I later learned, actually taken notes. Bettina reported a combative homeowner obstructing an official HOA inspection at my address. Dispatch put her on a brief hold. In the 30 seconds of hold music, she glanced up at me with an expression of composed authority. I said nothing. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I glanced at it. The text read, "On our way, Webb." I put the phone away. I looked at Bettina. "They're coming," I said. The cruiser turned onto Briarwood Court at 9:04 a.m. Not a response vehicle. Sergeant Webb had taken my instructions seriously, which meant she'd sent herself, in a standard patrol unit, rather than dispatching a junior officer who might walk into the scene without context. She pulled up at the curb in front of my house, got out with the unhurried precision of someone who already knows the shape of the situation, and walked up the driveway. Bettina saw her coming and straightened slightly, the clipboard rising half an inch. Law enforcement, finally, vindication. "Thank you for coming," Bettina said, with the practiced warmth of someone accustomed to being the most important person in the conversation. "I called because this gentleman is refusing to comply with an official HOA inspection, and I believe he may be—" "Ma'am." Webb had the specific flat authority of a person who has de-escalated several hundred situations and could do it in her sleep. "I have some background on this call. Can I ask your name?" "Bettina Whitmore, HOA board president." "Ms. Whitmore," Webb made a note. "And you are?" She was looking at me. "Darnell Okafor," I said. Webb gave the smallest nod that managed to contain an entire sentence's worth of meaning. The nod of a sergeant acknowledging her chief in the presence of someone who doesn't yet know she's looking at the chief. Then she looked back at Bettina. "The board's mandatory audit amendment," I said evenly, "was passed without an appeal provision. Cecily," I gestured to the doorway, where Cecily Farr appeared exactly on cue, holding a folder, wearing the expression of someone arriving at the precise moment they planned to arrive, "has a formal notice of invalidity that's been on file with the management company since January 8th. There is no enforceable audit." Bettina's clipboard arm dropped an inch. "That's not for you to decide. There's also," Cecily said, opening the folder, "the question of the fine schedule, which was never put to a resident vote, and the matter of approximately $9,000 in HOA administrative payments to a company registered in your name, without board disclosure or resident approval." The street was quiet enough in that moment that I could hear the fabric of Bettina's fleece shift as she breathed. From 2 houses down, Joellen Pask was walking toward us with a notepad. "I'm the police chief of Ridgecroft," I said. It was the first time I had said those words in this neighborhood in the 8 months I'd lived there. "I moved to Meadowlark Estates last July. I have not, in that time, done anything to obstruct this HOA or any of its legitimate functions. What I have done is document 14 months of pretextual violation notices, research the governing documents, file a legal petition, and retain counsel. Every one of those things is the lawful exercise of my rights as a property owner in this state. Bettina looked at Webb. Webb looked back at Bettina with the patient, neutral expression of someone who has understood the situation completely and has no intention of performing otherwise. "You're," Bettina started. "The chief," Webb confirmed. Cody, on the golf cart at the edge of the driveway, had gone very still in the way of a person reassessing an enormous number of recent decisions simultaneously. Joellen Pask reached the edge of the conversation. "Ms. Whitmore? I'm with the Courier. Could I get your comment on the special membership meeting that's been filed and on the board payments to Whitmore Property Management Solutions?" The color that left Bettina Whitmore's face in that moment, that specific, slow evacuation of composure, is something I will remember clearly for a long time. Not because I enjoyed it, but because it looked like the exact moment when a person who has told themselves one story about how the world works is confronted with the actual story and cannot find a way to make them fit together. She said nothing to Joellen. She looked at her clipboard. She looked at the fleece. She walked back across the cul-de-sac. Cody backed the golf cart out of my driveway without being asked. Everett Sims, who had appeared on his porch in a robe and slippers at some point during the preceding 4 minutes without my noticing, raised his coffee mug in my direction. I raised mine back. Webb made her report, confirmed no laws had been violated, noted the pending civil matters for the file, and drove away. Cecily made 3 phone calls. Joellen filled 2 full pages of notes. The HOA fleece, it turned out, had been the most expensive thing Bettina Whitmore ever put on. The special membership meeting was held on February 7th in the clubhouse that smelled of dry erase markers. And this time, the room was full. 112 of Meadowlark Estate's 174 units sent a representative. Joellen's story had run in the Courier 4 days earlier. Accurate, fair, and thorough. And the turnout reflected what happens when residents who have been quietly absorbing bad governance for years are handed a documented reason to show up. Bettina Whitmore did not attend. The vote to remove her as HOA president was 104 to 8. The 8, I later learned, were relatives. Gerald Fitch resigned from the board voluntarily 2 days before the meeting. Diana Pruitt had never formally returned from her sister's county. The HOA management company terminated their contract with the association within the week, citing the conflict of interest findings in their own liability review. Philip Greer sent me a brief professional email, thanking me for the documentation and not blaming me for the professional headache, which I appreciated. The legal resolution was quieter and took longer, the way these things do. Cecily filed a formal demand for restitution of the $9,000 in self-dealing payments on behalf of the HOA membership. Bettina retained her own attorney. After 3 months of back and forth that I mostly observed from a distance, they settled. A repayment plan for 75% of the payments, roughly $6,800, returned to the HOA's operational fund. Not a criminal proceeding, not a public drama. A civil settlement, documented, binding. The invalid fine schedule was another matter. 23 residents submitted documented claims under the CC and R's triple damages clause. The total came to just under $4,000. The newly constituted board, 3 new members, elected at the February meeting, one of whom was Marcus Donovan, voted to honor every claim from the existing reserve fund, which the financial disclosure had shown was adequately capitalized. Takeaway. HOA self-dealing by an officer is a civil matter, typically addressed through demand letters and settlement, but it creates a documented record that can trigger management company liability reviews and board removal under state HOA law. The dogwood tree out front came back in April. It does that. The over-trimming hadn't actually harmed it, just made it look worse than it was. The new growth came in thick and white-flowered and slightly wild, and it smelled the way spring in Tennessee smells when you're standing in a yard that is genuinely, unambiguously yours. Everett Sims came over to look at it. "That's a good tree," he said. "It is," I agreed. "What I want to tell you, and this is the part that matters beyond the legal mechanics and the satisfying logistics, is that the real cost of what Bettina Whitmore ran in Meadowlark Estates wasn't the fines. It was the years of residents like Millicent Vance feeling unable to hang wind chimes in their own yard, and the Osei family paying money they shouldn't have, and Everett Sims feeling like he had to manage his neighbors carefully to avoid becoming a target. That kind of low-grade intimidation, multiplied across a whole community, costs something that doesn't show up in a fine schedule. The new board used $3,000 of the recovered funds to establish a small resident assistance grant, available to any homeowner facing a genuine hardship with HOA-covered maintenance costs. The first recipient was Millicent Vance, who used it to repaint her front porch. She also put the wind chimes back up. As for Cody, I saw him at the fresh market about a month after everything settled. He was by himself, no golf cart, loading bags into the back of a car. He saw me. He looked like he was calculating whether to say something. He settled on, "Hey." "Hey," I said, and that was that. He's 16. He was following his mother's script. I harbor no particular grudge against a script follower, provided the script is retired. The new board is fine. The neighborhood is quieter. My deck holds up.